And first of all, I want to compliment all of you survivors. It means that Abdul Munim, we have to add to the resilience of the conflict, we also have the resilience of the audience. So our last session is about debating the future of Israel, and our opening remarks will be provided by Professor Asher Sassar and Professor Martin Kramer. I can say, well, first of all, their bios are in your program. They are two of Israel's top leading scholars of the Middle East, and now we're asking them to talk about Israel. So first of all, I have to tell you that before I came to Brandeis 12 years ago, Asher and Martin and I were colleagues at Tel Aviv University. I was there for 28 years. Asher actually arrived, I think, 5 years before I did, and Martin arrived 5 years after I did. So on the average, I've known them for 40 years. During which we've been very close friends and colleagues, and I'm happy to say that we remain so. By this time, 40 years, by this time, even without a GPS, Moses took the people of Israel all the way from Egypt to the Holy Land, to the Promised Land. Unfortunately, during those biblical days, people had a more relaxed view of time. And even in till the mid-70s, Soviet leaders gave 4 to 6 hour speeches. But I learned to live in an era of Snapchats and Instagram, meaning that Facebook and Twitter are passé, which makes all of us here dinosaurs. So regrettably and unfortunately, we don't live in the era of 4 to 6 hour speeches to the Soviet Politburo, and our panelists have only 20 minutes to present their views, at least to launch us into a discussion. Asher, are you going to go first?
Well, thank you very much, Shai. It's a great pleasure to be back here. I spent 2 very fruitful years here, some years back at the beginning of the Crown Center, and it was a wonderful experience for me, and great to be back at this wonderful school. Just briefly, if you mentioned Moses, the Bible says that Moses had a speech impediment. Hu haya kvad peh v'lashon. And he stuttered. And when he left Egypt and they were at Mount Sinai, they asked Moses, "Where are you taking us to?" And he began, they understood Canaan, but he meant Canada. And I must take a leaf out of Abdul Munim's talk. You know, Abdul Munim started with a personal note about studying the conflict and having participated in the conflict, and we are more or less the same age and fought in the same wars on the other side of the divide. And I think that both Abdul Munim and I certainly hope that I too can relate to the conflict with the balance and the empathy and the understanding of the other side, along with the fact that I am an Israeli, I'm a Zionist, I care for Israel a great deal, I've lived there the great majority of my life, and Israel's future is very much in my mind. But that should not obscure our capacity to look at the other side with understanding. We didn't drop out of the sky, and neither did they. So why has there been no agreement until now? Having not been able to make an agreement, you know, what are the various options? And at the end, what do I think Israel should actually do? So first, why no agreement? It's certainly not because of an intellectual failing of the Israelis and the Palestinians and everybody else who's tried to solve the conflict. It's not because somebody hasn't come up with the right idea yet. And it's not because we haven't been good students of conflict resolution. There are fundamental structural issues that keep the Israelis and the Palestinians apart. And here I come to a brief remark about the narratives. What is Israel for the Jews? Israel for the Jews is a grand historical act of self-defense against our horrific past. It is justice for the most oppressed of all peoples in the aftermath of the Second World War. Victory in 1948 and the establishment of an independent Israel, a sovereign state for the Jewish people, was the greatest achievement in 2,000 years of history and the epitome of justice in our time. Now, I intended to say exactly this even before I heard George Bisharat. But having heard him, I will add a sentence or two. You cannot talk about justice as the central objective if it doesn't include justice also for the Israelis. There is no justice without Israel. There is no justice without Palestine. We say in our anthem, Liyot am chofshi ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our country. We will not be a free people in our country until the Palestinians are a free people in theirs. But that is justice that takes into account both sides, not just one. The second point is about historical responsibility. We, the Israelis, are responsible for all our deeds and all our misdeeds. And the Palestinians are responsible for theirs. We are not responsible for the Palestinians' misdeeds, nor their historical mistakes. What is the Nakba? I fully understand what Israel is for the Palestinians. For the Palestinians, Israel is historical defeat, the loss of their homeland, refugeedom, displacement, the ultimate injustice, the complete opposite of how the Israelis understand themselves. And I would argue this is a major reason why we don't arrive at a historical end to the conflict. Because the narratives with which we live and according to which we define ourselves are so distant from each other that at present they're unbridgeable. Nakba in Arabic means a disaster. But Nakba in Arabic is a disaster in the natural sense, like an earthquake or a tsunami. Sadiq al-Azam, a historian, political philosopher, wrote a book after 1967. And the book was called Al-Naqd al-Zati Ba'd al-Hazima, Self-Criticism After the Defeat. And Sadiq al-Azam said, the use of the term Nakba is flight from taking responsibility. It is as if it fell upon you like an earthquake, for which you cannot be responsible if Irma in Miami wipes away your summer home. But you are responsible if you launch a war against the Israelis with genocidal intent. And that the Israelis won the war. Well, the Israelis are thankful for that. And probably won't apologize for it. And George said he doesn't like any nationalism. So why start with us? We didn't invent nationalism. People who only focus on Israel in their idea that they don't really like nationalism are suspect in my mind. And I'm sorry George isn't here to hear it. If you don't like nationalism, then you can't very well be a great supporter of Palestinian national rights either. It's either the one or the other. You can't have your cake and eat it. There is a major difference between the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and between Israel and the Arab states. Why have we made peace with Egypt and peace with Jordan and not with Palestine? The conflicts are very different. In the conflict between Egypt and Israel, or between Jordan, the same applies to Syria in theory. The critical matter is what I call the 1967 file. In 1967, we occupied their territory. If we trade their territory for peace, they and we can live with it. It might not be ideal, and the peace is lacking, and we would say cold peace and all sorts of other complaints. But for 40 years, we and the Arab states have not fought any wars. That is an amazing transition, which has changed the conflict altogether. With the Palestinians, there are two files. And 1967 is the junior file. The senior file is 1948. We don't have a 1948 file with Egypt. But we do have a 1948 file with the Palestinians. And we have not been able to resolve the conflict just on the basis of Resolution 242, because Resolution 242 only deals with the 1967 file. Resolution 242 was written in November 1967, after the war of 1967, in order to deal with the results of 1967. The Palestinians in 242 don't even appear. Even the paragraph on refugees in Resolution 242 doesn't mention the Palestinians. It could be refugees from Iraq, Jewish refugees. So after Oslo, we had the Oslo dynamic, which seemed to be reducing the conflict to its 67 dimensions, just talking about the West Bank and Gaza. The Israelis went to Camp David in 2000 with the idea of a great historical trade-off. Israel would concede on the 67 issues in exchange for closure on 1948. You can have the West Bank and Gaza, or the great majority of it, but no refugee return to Israel. It didn't work. And the Palestinians could not accept a solution that would only deal with the 67 questions like Egypt could. There has to be some element of historical correction for 1948 in order to arrive at a solution with the Palestinians. So that both sides agreed to a two-state solution, but had very different perceptions of what two states are. When the Israelis talk about two states, the Israelis think of two states where Israel has a security presence in the Palestinian state. The Israelis control the airspace, they have a military presence. Israel intrudes for its security requirements into the Palestinian state. Because the Israelis are never quite sure where the Palestinians would like to end the conflict. 67 or 48, how far back does the clock have to go? And the Palestinian state intrudes into Israel with the demand for refugee return, not to the Palestinian state, but to Israel proper. So these are what I call intrusive perceptions, mutually intrusive perceptions, that create an understanding of two states which is not mutually acceptable. So there is this profound mistrust, which, as people have said before me today, is not going to be overcome anytime soon. So what are the various options? One state, briefly, is not an option. One state means it's a euphemism for the undoing of Israel. Israelis will not cooperate. For people to say, well, we can't convince the Israelis to give up the West Bank, so let's have one state and convince the Israelis to give up their entire state. Well, that's just illogical. And the Israelis will not cooperate. Certainly not in the creation of one state, which eventually will turn the Israelis into a minority into this one state. And all one has to do is just look around the Middle East these days to see the fate of minorities. The Israelis are not looking for that kind of predicament. What Czechs and Slovaks couldn't do in Czechoslovakia, what Shiis and Sunnis couldn't do in Iraq, Israelis and Palestinians are not going to do in this one state of living happily ever after. It is a formula for endless conflict and is not really an option. There is the idea of confederation. Confederation, however, and you can read this in the Peel report of 1937, when Peel studied the problem of Palestine, where Peel calls for two states and rules out the idea of confederation. And what Peel says is that a confederation, this remains true to this day. To have a confederation requires a high level of intimacy and collaboration that if it existed, we would have had an agreement on two states a long time ago. How in this confederation are we going to have one foreign ministry, one defense ministry, one Mossad, one CIA? We and Hamas are going to collaborate on the creation of a common CIA? I mean, you must be joking. Now, people are it's just not serious. So what's left? Here, when we talk about what's left, we come to the basic questions of what is Israel all about? I would define myself as a classical Zionist. I'm a classical Zionist in the sense that I believe very strongly in the justice of Jewish self-determination. The Jews deserve the right to self-determination in their historical homeland, just like every other nation deserves, including the Palestinians. From the outset, the idea was to establish two things: the nation state of the Jewish people, that would also be a legitimate member of the family of nations. If we continue the occupation, even if we have all the security reasons to justify, if we continue the occupation, we will be neither of these. We will not be the nation state of the Jewish people. We will lose our character as the nation state of the Jewish people and eventually face the possibility of a minority. It's already equilibrium, as we have heard. And we won't be a legitimate member of the family of nations either. The status quo does not serve Israel's long-term interests, does not serve Israel's long-term survivability. It may have its short-term pluses. And people will say, having withdrawn unilaterally from Gaza and got the rockets in return, what do you want to get the same from the West Bank? It's a risk we have to take. Although there are many critics of the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, I know of no serious person in Israel who suggests that we should reoccupy Gaza because of the rockets. And when we withdrew from Gaza, We also withdrew 4 settlements from the northern West Bank, which is presently the quietest area in all of the West Bank. The Israelis are not there, there are no checkpoints, and there is no other, let's say, instability. The continuation of the occupation has negative consequences for Israel's domestic democratic process. I won't go into the details, but maybe we can talk about that later. And what I'm saying is that not that we can establish a two-state solution, but what I call for is for the recreation of a two-state dynamic, because we are presently in a one-state dynamic. A one-state dynamic which is not in Israel's long-term interests. It is self-defeating in the long run. Therefore, to create a two-state dynamic, solution is a big word, and we're not there yet, and this has been said very well throughout the day. What I am suggesting, Israel is powerful, militarily powerful, economically successful. We face an Arab world in deep crisis, surrounded by Arab states that are at different levels of domestic difficulty. This is a situation of risk, but it is also a situation of historical opportunity. We, the Zionists, always said, we want to revolutionize the situation of the Jewish people. We don't want to have our fate decided by others, as it was for centuries, with awful consequences. We must decide our fate ourselves. We are now capable of doing just that. We can decide what kind of Israel we want. And what I'm saying is that after 50 years of occupation, it's time for us to make the big decisions. Will this Israeli government do it? For sure not. For sure not. But at some time in the future, I hope and I even believe that there will be Israeli governments that perhaps for lack of any better choice will realize that we don't have other options. Sharon, of all people, not exactly a wild leftist, withdrew from Gaza for precisely these reasons. Sharon knew that the rockets wouldn't stop. But Sharon also knew that we cannot control millions of Palestinians forever. And the withdrawal from Gaza was phase one. Those who argue that Sharon sought to withdraw just from Gaza and no further, I think, and in fact I know, are wrong. Sharon's intentions went further. Occupation is by far not the only way in which Israel can defend itself. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of former Israeli generals and other senior officers of the IDF who are organized in two very active organizations who will tell you so. So this is time for Israel to launch an initiative of its own. And one can say, well, what about the Palestinians? I don't believe that we have the time to wait until the Palestinians get their act in order. And I do not agree to give Hamas the veto power of what Israel will look like in 10 or 15 years' time. We must decide to begin the process, which can take 7, 8, 9, 10 years, of rolling back the occupation, gradually withdrawing outlying settlements, reversing the process of settlement and occupation, reversing the process of what has been created by what I call settlerist neo-Zionism, which is not self-defensive Israel of classical Zionism, but rather a messianic, rather more religious, messianic, revolutionary approach to Zionism that I think is taking us down the wrong path. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back here at Brandeis. I first came here as a visiting professor some years ago, thanks to Professor Reinhardt at the time he was president. I also had the privilege of speaking at the inauguration of the Crown Center 12 years ago. At that time, I gave a list of expectations that I had of this center. And I have to say that 12 years later, those expectations not only have been met, but they have been exceeded. So congratulations, Shai, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm delighted also to share a podium with my old friend Asher Sasser. One of the things I learned when Asher and I, we used to go on the road together for Tel Aviv University. And one of the things I learned is that he's a hard act to follow. And it's not just his rhetorical style and his elegant logic, but his obvious passion. And that's because Asher is a man with a plan. Now, he's always careful to say that he isn't offering a solution, and he said that here again, but it certainly is a plan. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have never had a plan. I don't even have a political party. I wander in that great floating Israeli center that swings elections and that's totally pragmatic, that changes direction when it sees some plan has gone awry, as they often do. And if the doubts of people like me can't be put to rest, no alternative plan has a future. So I have no plan to present. Instead, I have a series of questions. But together they point in a direction, and I propose to follow them where they lead. Now let me begin by pointing out where Asher and I agree, and the amount of agreement between us is extensive. For both of us, Israel is and should be a Jewish state, the political expression of the Jewish right to self-determination. There's a lot of room to discuss just what that means. At a minimum, though, it means that every Jewish Israeli should see in the state of Israel some expression of his or her own understanding of what it is to be a Jew. That's what allowed both communists and Orthodox believers to sign Israel's Declaration of Independence in 1948. We also both value democracy as the supporting source of Israel's legitimacy. It's not why Israel should exist, but it's how Israel should exist. And finally, we both agree that directly ruling over Palestinians who aren't Israelis is a problem. Yet neither of us sees any prospect for an Israeli-Palestinian agreement which would resolve all outstanding issues in the framework of a two-state solution. But it's here that Asher and I part ways. Why? First, Asher believes that he sees where history is going, that it's to a dark place, and so we must urgently reverse it now. I'm either humbler or less prescient than Asher. I'm not sure I see where history is going or whether the dark place isn't down precisely the road that he would follow. Now, it is possible to debate endlessly the bad things that could happen if Israel remains in the West Bank, and the similarly bad things that could happen if Israel withdraws unilaterally. I call this worst-case scenarioism, which is usually delivered with very Jeremiah-like certainty. Now, the person who did the most in this country to popularize the plan proposed by Asher was the Israeli journalist Ari Shavit. Shavit trafficked in worst-case scenarios. In his weekly Haaretz column, this was always the last chance, the 11th hour, the decisive year. A year ago in May, he warned, and I'm quoting him, "Time is running out. By 2025, it will no longer be possible to separate Israel from the Palestinians. Life without separation in close quarters with Hamas and the Islamic State will become untenable. In a decade's time, the international community will probably turn its back on us, and Israel will become an ostracized nation with no foreign investments and meaningful exports. Life will become miserable and bleak. The pillars that are holding up our society will disintegrate. The ongoing chaos that is laying waste to our neighbors will engulf us. Waves of terror and international sanctions may upend a nation whose identity has been shattered. And on and on and on. I can bring you a dozen verses from the prophets in the same rhetorical style. The problem with worst-case scenarioism is that both sides can play it. Let me bring as an example our mutual friend, Hirsch Goodman. Hirsch favors a two-state solution, but thinks unilateralism will distance it and bring disaster in its wake. Listen to his cascade of arguments. Without an Israeli security presence, the illicit Palestinian arms industry in the West Bank will flourish, and terrorism will become legitimized and encouraged. Key strategic Israeli targets like the neighborhoods in Jerusalem or Kfar Saba and the entire center of Israel, including Ben Gurion Airport, could be menaced and closed down at will by a primitive rocket. Recapturing these territories would be problematic. Israel will be perceived as leaving the battlefield in the face of adversity. This will encourage the extremists and undermine Israeli deterrence. Without Israel there to anchor Fatah's control of the PA, Hamas will soon take over, central government will break down, and chaos and factional violence will emerge, impacting on Jordan and on regional stability in general, and on and on. Terror, chaos, and isolation. To listen to Shavit and Goodman, Israel is damned if it does, and damned if it doesn't. Now, I'm going to leave this ping-pong aside for now. My point is that worst-case scenarioism is the worst way to approach the future because it doesn't work. On the first page of Shavit's book, he writes this sentence: "As long as I can remember, I remember fear, existential fear." But that's not Israel of the generations younger than us. The Israel Democracy Institute published a poll in the spring which showed that Israelis are inveterate optimists. 71% said they were optimistic or very optimistic about the future. And 81% saw Israel's ability to maintain the country's security as moderately good or good. And please note these percentages are much higher than the support, the electoral support for the right. You can't sell fear to Israelis. You can only sell hope. Which is why, and here I come to my second point, I don't think that Asher's plan will be realized. It's just not on the Israeli agenda. Israelis want peace. They'll give land for peace, and they already have. They won't give land for nothing. In 1967, Israel decided that it would never abandon Jerusalem, never return to the pre-67 lines, and never relinquish territory occupied in that war for less than peace. Those were Israel's three no's, or its red lines. They've determined everything that has happened since. Oslo and the Gaza withdrawal were only minor tweaks to that basic approach, which is still at the heart of the Israeli consensus. And since experts like Asher Susser and Hirsch Goodman are in total disagreement over the implications of land for nothing, this isn't going to change. When the public is already optimistic about the future on the basis of the present as it is, where is support for rolling the dice? Perhaps Israelis are myopic or foolish, not impossible. But it is what it is. Asher has told us that the Palestinian view is what it is and won't change anytime soon. It's a given. I agree. But I'm only extending this kind of hard-nosed analysis that Asher has done for the Palestinian reality to the Israeli one. So let me make the hard-nosed analysis of the Israeli givens. Let's start with the fact that the Israeli political order is more fragmented than ever. In each election, the leading party has fewer and fewer seats in the 120-member Knesset. Netanyahu's years in office may break Ben-Gurion's record, but Mapai, under Ben-Gurion, always had at least 40 seats in the Knesset and averaged in the mid-40s. Under Netanyahu, the Likud has averaged in the mid-20s, and the present number, 30, is a high. This handicaps governance, which is the defining feature of Israeli politics today. The bottom line is that there is no stable majority for any bold long-term strategy of Asher's sort, a strategy that would take many years to implement. He says, as long as a decade. Even if a government were somehow to start, it wouldn't last long enough to finish, as in the case of Oslo. Now, a historic leader might have been able to surmount this obstacle. We discussed leadership earlier in the day. I define a historic leader as someone with legendary credentials and a record of cutting through political knots. And you know the names. I don't have to repeat them. But for better or worse, Israel is out of them. There are many reasons, but let's call it the reversion to the norm. No nation, no matter how great, can consistently generate great leaders, as Americans know too well. Israel is in an era of lesser leaders, also tainted by opportunism and borderline corruption. Now remember what Asher's plan involves. Israel would have to remove perhaps 80,000 settlers from their homes. These are just those who live outside the settlement blocks. This is an order of magnitude more than were removed from Gaza. It is Gaza 10 times over. Even over 10 years, it's a Gaza withdrawal every year. Who is going to lead the nation on this perilous trek? Who will be our Moses, mentioned earlier? Who will be our Moses in this desert? And have no doubt it would be perilous. Nothing has such powerful potential to divide the people as an attempt to divide the land. The last time it was tried, a prime minister was killed. It has the latent potential to kill Israeli democracy altogether, much more so than the occupation, which Israeli democracy manages somehow to take in stride. The unity of Israel is its qualitative edge, and anything that undermines it is a strategic threat. Historic political leaders had the genius to mitigate the divisions and take bold moves. Ariel Sharon was the last one able to do that. I agree with Asher. And some thought Netanyahu might. Back in 2012, Asher said at a conference here that, and I quote him, "If Netanyahu, as the head of a new government, chooses to take the centrist secular role, there is a real possibility that this could become policy." But more than 5 years have passed, nothing of the sort has happened. Not only has Netanyahu not moved to the center has moved towards him. So no, the answer is that Israel has no historic leadership. And the sudden about-faces that we saw in Yitzhak Rabin and Ariel Sharon were more likely the last of their kind than a recurring phenomenon. Finally, let me add one last reason that it's not going to happen. There's something anachronistic well into this 21st century about the forced removal of tens of thousands of inhabitants from any territory. It was being done everywhere after World War II. Israel did it in 1948 to Arabs in places like Lida and Ramla. And you could forcibly settle people without asking them. Israel did it to many immigrant Jews in the 1950s. But the forced evacuation and demolition of Yamit and the Gaza settlements were, I think, the last flickers of this approach. I don't believe that a liberal Western democracy in this century still has such options. Such things might still happen in the midst of desperate wars. But in peacetime, neither Arabs nor Jews can be forced from their homes. It's just too late in history. Any future solution has to leave Israeli settlers a reasonable option of remaining where they are, and that can only be the product of a deeper agreement. So I've told you why I believe unilateral withdrawal is a non-starter. Israelis, having been told for decades that the solution lies in land for peace, don't buy the supposedly superior wisdom of land for nothing. Israel's political system doesn't have the capacity to affect it anyway, and there isn't a leadership anywhere on the spectrum that's strong enough to impose it. Finally, it's out of sync with the values of the present day. We can debate it, and I'm sure we will, but it's a purely theoretical debate, and it's not that much different from a debate about the one-state solution. So the more interesting question is to ask what can and should be done in the real world of these givens, both Palestinian and Israeli. Today, there is a situation, let's call it the status quo, that's been remarkably durable given the winds of change that have buffeted the Middle East. Both Israelis and Palestinians continue to invest in it, maintain it, sustain it. If they didn't, it would have collapsed long ago. On the ground, the Israeli state, the Palestinian Authority, and the Hamas government all have their own political spheres. The sides of this triangle are under constant stress, We saw that again in the Temple Mount crisis over the summer. But such crisis, instead of boiling over, receded. And that has happened also time and again. If you do a Google search for the Third Intifada, you'll find that people have been predicting it for years. The fact that it hasn't happened is a testament to the residual effects of the second one and the cautious policies followed by Netanyahu and Abu Mazen. Now, the question is whether this status quo can evolve further while maintaining an equilibrium. Let me say where it's not evolving. It isn't toward a one-state reality. For the one-state reality to take hold, here I agree with Asher, Israel would have to dismantle itself after first dismantling the authority, destroying Hamas. And this Israel will not do. So all of these spheres will continue to exist. It's not two states, but it isn't one state either. Now, you can't live with that kind of ambiguity. What are you doing in the Middle East? So how might this status quo evolve? Asher has said that after Israel withdraws, a kind of two-state dynamic will emerge. Let's call it an armistice. Not a peace, but a quasi-peace. In fact, an armistice has taken hold without an Israeli withdrawal. Israel cooperates on security with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, again, recently has openly called for a long-term armistice, and not a single settler has been relocated. De facto armistice is the big picture reality. Netanyahu didn't have the epiphany some would have liked him to have. He hasn't come up with a peace plan, but he's broken potential cycles of violence, and his approach has been, in many respects, one of live and let live. Is it ideal? Don't be absurd. But it's better than most periods in the history of Israeli-Palestinian relations. The life of a nation is a long game, and that of Israel longer than most. No single generation is charged with anticipating and solving all the problems of the future. There's a relevant story here about Ben-Gurion. In 1937, he pushed for acceptance of the Peel Partition Plan that would have created a minuscule Jewish state. And Golda Meir was worried. What if the Jewish population, which would be swollen by refugees, would reach 3 million, far beyond the carrying capacity of the state? Ben-Gurion replied, and I quote him, "What will happen after 3 million Jews come to this Jewish state? We shall see afterward. The future generations will take care of themselves. We must concern ourselves with this generation." End of quote. Israel is changing rapidly, growing in numbers and diversity in a globalized world and a tumultuous Middle East. Our generation took care of itself. It made mistakes, but it also left Israel stronger and at peace with important neighbors. The next generation will build on this inheritance in accord with the values we imparted, but also its own fresh reading of Israel's destiny. We never found a full solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we created a framework for Israeli-Palestinian coexistence. Political reform, new leaders, fresh ideas. These are more likely to arise from an Israel united than an Israel divided, and from the much maligned status quo. Thank you.
Good. Everybody's been surprisingly disciplined today, which means that we have the time for discussion. Arizona, you want to come in first?
Sure. The first question, I think, is for Professor Susser. What does the Israeli center-left need to do to regain the support of the Israeli electorate? How do they sell to the Israeli public their vision for achieving peace with the Palestinians? Thank you.
Is it the secular left?
Ed, do you want to return repeat the end of the question?
No, center left. Okay, I got it.
The last part.
Yeah.
How do they sell to the Israeli public their vision for achieving peace with the Palestinians? They being the Israeli center-left.
Center-left. Okay. Nadim? Or anybody else at Tufts?
Hi, yes, we do. We have. Hi, Shai, this is Karim Al-Adi.
Oh. أهلا وسهلا.
Alan Beek. So I have two questions for Professor Susser. The first one is why can't the Israeli religious right or the right in general see your argument about the existential threat to Israel by the occupation? That's the first question. The second question is, I think, is a bit complicated. It's about your introductory remarks about 1948 and or the creation of the State of Israel, and saying that it's a manifestation of justice. So I see your point that it's a success story, it's an achievement for the Jews, but why do you say it's justice when justice involves getting your just against the people who oppress the Jews, murder Jews, like pogroms, Holocaust? Those went unpunished. So why do you use the term justice in the creation of Israel when justice was not really served against the societies that practiced injustice against the Jews, particularly in Europe? This is what I mean. Thank you.
Good, understood. All right. Brandeis?
If Netanyahu should be forced from office in the next 6 months or a year, what impact do you think that might have on the prospects for peace?
Asher, you want to start?
Yeah. Well, how does the center-left sell an argument like mine to the Israeli public? I have to concede it's a tough sell. My complaint of the Israeli political leadership is that in recent years nobody has had the guts to make the sell at all. Herzog never had the guts to run on such a platform, even though many in the Labour Party agree with what I say. When Sharon spoke about Gaza, I was personally involved in selling the withdrawal from Gaza to the Israeli public, and it was easy as pie. We used to go, Emanuel Trachtenberg and others from different parts of Israel to talk about this, and it wasn't difficult at all. Granted, the West Bank is not Gaza. But Sharon, for the withdrawal from Gaza, had 70% approval rating. I think, first of all, there has to be, the historical rationale. And Martin made a very good case for the continuation of the status quo. But I personally believe that the status quo is disastrous for Israel. It is presently so, it is internationally so. To imagine Israel using so much of its military capital to run the West Bank and to police the Palestinians is having a detrimental effect on Israel domestically and internationally, needless to say. And we are ending up in a one-state reality. And more people, even here today, talk about the one-state reality. The two states is no longer on the table, which I think is wrong. But the argument that we have to make is this. For Israel to maintain itself as the legitimate, democratic nation-state of the Jewish people, the occupation cannot continue for another 50 years. It shouldn't continue for another 10 years either. The Palestinians are in disarray. It's a long wait for them to get their act in order to negotiate this. In the meantime, we must turn the clock of history. And we can do it. We have the power to do it, and we can do it. The settlers and those who support them are a minority of the Israeli population. As a Democrat, I don't see why it is that the majority of Israelis who would gladly part with territory for a more acceptable Israel to themselves and to the international community, and also an Israel potentially with a better relationship with the Palestinians next door. I think it's not a sell that is impossible to make if what we tell the people is that this is a struggle about Israel's soul, about the destiny of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. There is nothing Israelis value more than Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people. We will find that increasingly difficult to maintain when the number of Palestinians within Palestine is not 6 million like the number of Jews, but 7 or 8 million. So this is a situation that we have to put an end to sooner rather than later. And that is not an argument that I think the majority of the Israeli people could not be brought to understand if the argument were to be made significantly, effectively, consistently by a leadership that has a measure of guts. If the Labour Party runs as it did in the last elections on whether there should be a third assistant in children's kindergartens in addition to the 2 that they already are, well, I won't vote for a Labour Party like that. If that's what Herzog has to say because he's afraid to take the settler issue head on, this is an argument that the Israeli political elite, the center-left, hasn't had the guts to make, and if it were to make it, it's not a lost cause at all. The argument that there is nothing that we can do about it and the Israeli given is the Israeli given is an argument just to let things be as they are, and as they are is not good enough. You're right that we accept the Palestinian given, but I'm not a Palestinian. I'm an Israeli. I want Israel to change, and I will do whatever I can to do it. I can't change the Palestinians. That Ziad has to do, and George Bisharat from California. I want to have an effect on where Israel is going. It's dear to my heart. It's the fate of your children and our grandchildren. We can't look at this as if we are dispassionate analysts from Denmark. I'm not from the UN. And on this issue, I have an opinion. And this opinion I will fight for, because I think it's right. There are 1 million Israelis who live outside Israel permanently. Many more are leaving. And they are not the worst of Israelis. Some of them are the very best of our people, because they don't see a good future. And they see more enticing opportunities elsewhere. A friend of mine was on a trip to New Brunswick, St. John's, New Brunswick. Not the center of the universe. And he found new Israelis there. What is becoming of us? The fact that there are close to 1 million Israelis who live abroad is the greatest defeat of the Zionist enterprise.
That's wrong. You know it.
Excuse me?
It's incorrect, and you know it. Migration is one of the best things the internet has brought the world, and integration amongst all communities brings diversity to the world and is accepted by everybody except for yourself, sir.
Then I'll just have to be the one who doesn't accept it. I don't think it does Israel any good that 1 million Israelis have left.
You left South Africa, and you're enjoying Israel, sir.
That's what I think Jews should do.
Right. You left South Africa. I'm an American now.
Thierry, I didn't say anything about Americans. I said the 1 million Israelis who have left Israel. And I think it's a great loss to Israel. What can I say? I think it is. Why the Israeli right can't see what I see? I think they can see what I see, but they think they have a solution. And it's one that may entail just more of the same. More oppression, more occupation. The settler right comes from a different worldview. A worldview that speaks in terms of religious messianic redemption. Not my language, not my cup of tea. I'm a believer in secular Zionism. And their view is not the majority view in Israel. Their party at present, the party that reflects and represents them more than any other, in Israel has 8 seats in the Knesset. They have more in the Likud, granted. They don't have a majority in the Israeli Knesset. They don't have a majority in the Israeli population. Why do I think 1948 was a manifestation of justice? What I said was that's the Jewish narrative. And I said the Palestinian narrative sees 1948 as the manifestation of injustice. And the gentleman who asked the question sees it from the Palestinian side, which I do not. I can understand the Palestinians seeing this as the manifestation of injustice. And even the argument he made is a very old argument that the Palestinians have been making for decades. Why should the Palestinians pay the price of cruelty and injustice imposed on the Israelis by Ukrainians and Germans? That is a long-standing Palestinian argument and quite understandable. But the Israelis do see the creation of their state against the background of their oppression as the manifestation of justice for the Jewish people. The fact that Palestinians don't see it that way is understandable to me, but it's not the way I see it. And there are different narratives. That's exactly the point I was making. And the last question, if Netanyahu is forced for government, I'll leave to you.
Sure. If Netanyahu is forced for government, there will be a struggle for ascendancy in the Likud party. I won't go down the list of candidates and wannabes who would like to take over what is still the leading party in Israeli politics. Paradoxically, some of the polls show that a Likud under the leadership of one or another would actually do better in the next election than under Netanyahu. We don't know. So it's certainly an open question, but I don't think it will change the fundamental dynamic. I think that the Likud, perhaps unlike the Labour Party, does have a bench of figures who could emerge as potential party leaders with at least as strong a hold over the party as Netanyahu. I just want to clarify one thing. Asher said I made a strong case for the status quo. I was not an advocate of the status quo. I take the status quo as a point of departure. You take a change in the status quo as your point of departure. You think we have to change the status quo, we reach a certain point, 10 years from now, 12 years from now, however long it takes for, say, the Labour to come to party and to implement this plan as your point of departure. And it doesn't, to some extent, it does remind me a bit of George Bisharat, who sat here and said, well, it may take 20 or 30 years. We can discuss it in the meantime. We can discuss this in the meantime. But what do we do? And here I get to something that Ziad said. We have this period between now and then. What do we do? It may be that there's value in discussing your plan, because then it makes more likely another possibility, a settlement freeze, stop building or expanding outlying settlements and so forth and so on. That's asking for more in order to get less. Although I don't think that's what you're doing. You really mean what you say when you articulate your plan. But I take this, as I say, as my point of departure. The other thing is the question of occupation. Look, there are different occupations. Occupation means one thing in Gaza, and it means something else in Ramallah, and it means something else in Jenin, and north of Jenin, it means something else in Hebron. Not all occupations are the same. And it's the diversification of this occupation which allows Israel to continue its overall control of the envelope that is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And that overall control is something that Israel will insist upon in any final status agreement in the security domain. So what we're getting is a variation on a theme and not necessarily, again, leading into something which could be more articulated further down the road. As to the settlers being a minority, again, there are settlers and there are settlers. There is the 80,000 in the outlying settlers, but then there are settlers in the blocks. And then there's Jerusalem. And then you find out that according to international law, 1 out of every 10 Israelis is a settler. And everybody knows one, or has one in their family. And you discover that the young generation doesn't know where the Green Line was. They have no clue. It hasn't been on maps in schools for years. So the idea that the settlers are a small minority, I think, is belied by the political, not just the political impact they have, but by the social networks that they have, which mean that, which have magnified their political power. And these are people who believe, and it's not just the settlers, that to be a nation state of the Jewish people cannot be a state which removes Jews from their homes in the land of Israel. We can agree about it, not disagree about it, but I think there may be a majority of Israelis who believe this. Finally, I don't buy the idea that these million left because they were dissatisfied with the political situation. We know that
I don't say that.
Multiple causes for this. It's not a failure of Zionism. There are many pulls and pushes in the international arena that talented people do move back and forth. And I can say, and to some extent, you know, I see look, we're a conference of grandfathers here. Who was on the panel? Who were on the panel? I think I'm the youngest one, and I'm a grandfather, too. There's a certain nostalgia for Israel as it was, little Israel as it was at that time. You talk to young people, there's no nostalgia for that. I teach, and I'm a parent. I encounter young people all the time. And what I see reflected in them is what I saw in that Israel Democracy Institute poll, which is a fundamental optimism, a sense that Israel is a place full of opportunity, of which they're taking advantage, and there's none of this doom and gloom. So we have to be very careful as older people looking back in the past, not to project our nostalgia on the young generation, which is about to assume, and is already assuming, its responsibilities in the political domain.
If I just a point on this issue of emigration from Israel. I don't say that people emigrate from Israel because of the political situation only. But there is an outflow of young people from Israel and young professional people in huge numbers. And I'm not pontificating, not to you and not to anybody else. My own son lives in Toronto. And this is exactly why I know the story. He and his generation, there are just too many of them who are going to other places. And they are not the worst of Israelis. And this, the reason why I say that this is a failure of Zionism, I'm not blaming the Netanyahu government. It's a failure of the Zionist project. If it was our aspiration to congregate the Jewish people in Eretz Israel, for 1 million Israelis, it's a huge number. To be living elsewhere is our failure, yours and mine and our society. We have built our project with great success, but on two fundamental assumptions of the Zionist idea. We were wrong. And the one was, and we go back to the Balfour Declaration, the logic of Weizmann and of his generation was that when given the opportunity, the majority of Jews would go to Eretz Israel. But they didn't. That's our choice. And the second assumption was that the Arabs would benefit from the Zionist project and would eventually embrace it. And they didn't either. This goes to back to the Balfour Declaration. The belief was that both the Jewish people in greater numbers would come to Eretz Israel and we would establish a majority. And that the Arabs in the end would accept it. And both of these assumptions were wrong. And therefore, even amongst the formulators of the Balfour Declaration, there were those who thought that very soon after the war ended, the First World War, Jews would be emigrating in droves to Palestine as the Zionists told them. President Wilson said something in those terms at the time. And that didn't materialize. And from here we get to partition. The very legitimacy in the eyes of the international community of the Jewish state is linked from the outset to the acceptance of partition. The more we evade and distance ourselves from the idea of partition, so we ourselves contribute to the erosion of Israel's international legitimacy. The Israeli government blames human rights organizations in Israel for criticizing Israel abroad publicly and therefore eroding Israel's legitimacy. Peace Now and the soldiers breaking the silence, etc. Not that I agree with everything they say and the way they do what they do, but the major erosion of Israeli international legitimacy is government policy, not these human rights organizations. And we should get that into our minds too. There was a word about climate change earlier. We spoke now about Gaza and the different kinds of occupation. Gaza is turning into a humanitarian crisis. In the Israeli defense establishment, there are presently ideas, going back to the talk about climate change and environmental issues, to build in Gaza a port, a power station, and a desalination plant. That Israel should involve itself in the building of these three massive projects. If this were to be done in Gaza in the foreseeable future, in the next few years, as people in our defense establishment think, we can improve the lot of Gaza a great deal, again, by an Israeli unilateral initiative. One word on settlers. There are very different kinds of settlers. True. There are Haredim, who are the largest increasing group amongst the settlers.
In Israel in general.
But amongst the settlers also, Haredim, not other people who are going to the settlers. And the Haredim live in places that are very near to the Green Line, not very nationalistic at all in their overall view. Most of the settlers, 250 to 300,000 of them, not even talking about Jerusalem, live in settlement blocks that will be part of Israel even in the eyes of the far, far Israeli left. And amongst these settlers, there are people who agree with what I'm saying. There are settlers who agree with what I'm saying, who do believe that there is a possibility of moderating the settler initiative for the sake of the larger well-being of the overall state of Israel. I don't claim that they're a majority of the settlers, but the settlers are a very mixed crowd. And some of them are not entirely opposed to any kind of political progress.
You want to go on and collect some more questions?
Okay, sure. Ed, you want to come in? Arizona.
Arizona, you just need to unmute yourself. Arizona is currently muted. Please unmute yourself.
I see. They muted themselves.
Yeah, Arizona, can you please unmute yourself and repeat the question? Thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. The question is, how does Israel deal with the social conflict between the religious and secular and its impact on Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians? Thank you.
Good. Nadim or anybody else at Fletcher?
No, I don't think there are any questions here.
Okay. So this obviously will be the last round, and you wanted to ask a question.
In Caroline Glick's book, The Israeli Solution, she suggests that the demographic projections from the Palestinians are greatly exaggerated. The Palestinian birth rate is dropping, the Israeli birth rate is increasing, and she's advocating that Israel assert sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. And that would benefit not only the Israelis, but would benefit the Palestinians, because the Palestinians would be given the educational benefits, the health benefits, and eliminate the incompetence and human rights violations caused by the Palestinian Authority. I'd be interested in your reaction to Caroline Glick's proposal.
Okay, that will be our last round. So, Asher, you want to go first?
I let Marty go first this time.
Marty, you want to go first?
Well, the religious and secular conflict and its impact, how does one ameliorate that? I've actually, since I left Tel Aviv University, we were colleagues, I began a second life in Jerusalem, running a college which has much more diverse from a religious point of view than the typical student population at Tel Aviv University. And on some of our faculty and among some of our students, there are settlers. And I have found myself often in a room, and this is the only person who is not wearing a skull cap in various meetings. What can one do? All one can do is to open channels of dialogue with people and to discuss these issues openly. Classroom setting, political settings, because they live in enclosed worlds. It was President Rivlin described Israel as having devolved into tribes. And of course, it's very comfortable to reside in one's tribe. One isn't challenged. One's ideas echo back once they're expressed. What has to be created are more and more frameworks in which people find themselves outside of their comfortable tribal setting. And by that, and here I would emphasize that, to my mind, as important, if not greater, to the future of Israel is resolving the question of the religious-secular divide. I don't see the Israeli-Palestinian divide as something which is nearly as threatening to Israel's future as a possibility of an internal division. And we know this from the history of the Jews. It's been internal division which has always been the precursor to the fall. Which is why I say that we have to be very cautious moving forward, that we don't do things which we know in advance will have only one major effect, which is to divide the people against itself and create the same dynamic which we had to some extent in the 1990s. On Caroline Glick, I'm very reluctant to even debate scenarios which aren't going to happen. This was true of George Besharat, and this is true of also Caroline Glick's proposal. Israel's not going to annex the West Bank. I don't see any scenario in which Israel would annex the West Bank, which is what she advocated. I don't see any political party in Israel which is out and out for annexation of the West Bank in its entirety. And those who support the annexation of various parts of the West Bank are definitely in the minority in terms of unilateral annexation. So our time is short. Why waste? I have a question for Asher here, which is this. We also often hear about the eroding legitimacy of Israel. I ask myself, from what point? Give me a date and tell me that our international legitimacy has eroded since then. Is it 1948? Is it 1967? Is it 1987? Is it 1995? Because when I look around, what I see is that Israel is always, in net terms, always gaining international legitimacy. It may not be the case in certain quarters on the American campus, but the world is a much bigger place than that. And when you see world leaders lining up to come to Israel, including countries with which we had no relations 20 years ago, and now their heads of state and prime ministers are coming, I say, from what point do you say that our international legitimacy has eroded? I'd like to know the date so that I can make the comparison.
The date is 1967. And the turning point is the occupation. Not immediate. If you take Resolution 242, which was passed in November 1967, it's a very pro-Israeli resolution. It's a resolution that understands the war of 1967, not as a war of aggression, but as a war of self-defense. And therefore, the notion of land for peace. The UN could have said to Israel, you must withdraw from the West Bank tomorrow morning, immediately, which they didn't say. Many people speak about the Israeli illegal occupation. Well, the occupation in my mind is undesirable, but legal. Not everything that is legal is desirable. Not everything that is desirable is legal, as we know. But the occupation is not illegal. And the resolution was still very much in defense, I would say, of Little Israel. Take UN Resolution 2334, the last one, Security Council resolution, and Kerry's speech thereafter. What does the resolution say? And what does Kerry say? What did the Clinton parameters say? Actually, since 1967, the international endorsement and support for Little Israel has increased. There is no erosion, no challenging of Israel within the 67 boundaries, which before 67 was not unchallenged. But the occupation is calling into question also the legitimacy of Little Israel. And what Kerry said and what the resolution 2334 are saying is that the international community must distinguish between Israel, Little Israel, which is perfectly legitimate, and the occupation, which is not. And there is a connection between the two. And the turning point, slowly but surely, after 1967, when it becomes increasingly clear that Israel is shifting away from the partition, the logic of partition. And I think one has to be, I mean, it's not difficult to see. The relations, not between, let's say, Israel and Asia, relations have actually improved immensely. India, China, Japan, since the 1990s, they have improved dramatically. I think very much thanks to Oslo, by the way, which is also linked to the idea of partition. But where Israel has lost is in a very important constituency for Israel's long-term survivability. And that is the United States and Western Europe. Israel in the US was what you guys call a bipartisan cause. Israel increasingly is becoming a cause of certain parts of the Republican Party, not even all of it. And the Democratic Party supports Israel far less than it used to be. There is something that is even eroding vis-a-vis the Jewish community and its attachment to Israel. And this is serious stuff, which I think we shouldn't ignore. But my main point is not that we should do what I suggested we should do for the sake of Israel's international legitimacy. That's the byproduct. The real issue is the character of Israel as a country itself. This is what concerns me. What I call Israel's soul. And this is, for me, the most important issue. The international legitimacy will follow. And it's not to get an international pat on the back that we should do X, Y, Z. We should do X, Y, Z for the sake of the justice of our cause in our own eyes, in what we believe in, for the sake of the Zionist cause that we have endeared all our lives. That's what, for me, that's what it's all about.
So what we're going to do now is I'm going to make one or two comments, and then the screen will come down. We're going to leave the stage. The screen will come down, and Nadim Shahadi at Tufts is going to say a few words. We're a little bit early, so I hope Nadim has collected his thoughts together. And as I said, I'll say just a few words to give him time to collect his thoughts. Before I thank Martin and Asher, I think that I said in the beginning that the Crown Center's pillar is the idea of balanced and dispassionate analysis. We, as a center, don't have a policy. We're not a policy center. We like to see ourselves as policy relevant, but policy relevant in the sense that we think that those who want to think about policy vis-a-vis the Middle East should be slightly better informed. And all we are trying to do is provide this service of making sure, or at least trying to make sure, that those who are involved directly or indirectly in formulating policy regarding the Middle East will be better informed. And I think that what we've done in the last 5 and something hours is very much in line with the second pillar. I certainly feel that and I regard myself as one of those masochists that wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night thinking about these issues. But I learned a lot from these interactions, and especially from these debates. And we also managed to do something that 12 years ago, when we were established, I think the common attitude about what are the boundaries of a discussion about the Middle East in this country. Many people, again, was it 20 years ago, 17 years ago, when Martin, you published your very influential monograph on the state of Middle East studies in America. It was 17 years ago, something
2001.
like that. Huh?
2001.
2001, 16 years ago. I think that people were impressed reading this very, very interesting monograph, that so many centers of Middle East studies have become basically advocacy groups, and that also that the topic is too politicized, too sensitive to have a civilized conversation. And I think that one thing we've done, that was not our purpose, but I think one of the unintended consequences of what we've done over these last 12 years is that we've kind of defied this common wisdom. And I think we showed that by taking a different approach, by accepting the fact that there are competing narratives about every turning point in the history of the conflict, and that the competing narratives are equally legitimate, we've actually proved, or at least provided strong evidence that it is possible to conduct a civilized conversation about the Middle East. And I think you saw today, 2 Palestinians disagreeing, 2 Israelis disagreeing, and doing it in a very civilized way. That's the positive side. The negative side, I would say, is that I think unfortunately, I think one thread was very clear throughout the 2 sessions that dealt with the present and the future. And that is, I think, somewhere, the word that I would describe as despair. I think there is despair on the Palestinian side, and I think there is despair on the Israeli side, although, of course, with different gradations, especially gradations regarding whether one can live with the despair or how intolerable is the situation. At the same time, I would say that I have a lot of respect for people who, in a situation of despair, keep looking for cracks. I say that we're like basically entrepreneurs, as individuals, not as institutions, but as individuals dealing with this question. I see us as something similar to entrepreneurs in a very, 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 very bad economy. Okay? So what characterizes entrepreneurs in a very, 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 very bad economy is that they don't have the luxury of saying, I'll come back in 10 years. No, they still keep looking for small cracks. And I think that came very much across Ziad's comments and Asher's comments and so on. So I think that's important. I think the other thing that is a common problem that we have in assessing the situation both among Israelis and among Palestinians is that first of all, when we try to decipher the DNA of Israelis and Palestinians, and we often talk about majority views, minority views, what has more support, what has less support. I think that this is important, but we also have to be very cognizant of two asymmetries that exist not between Israelis and Palestinians, but among Israelis and among Palestinians. The first is the asymmetry in determination. The fact of the matter is that the rejectionists, at least rejectionists for a two-state solution, on both sides are much more organized, much more galvanized, much more motivated than the center and the left of center. And I think that's true on both sides. And therefore, the limitation of, I argue with my colleagues who will be here in 5 or 6 weeks, Khalil Shikaki, that the problem with public opinion polls on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side is that they give you the distribution of opinion, but not the distribution of intensity with which opinions are being held. And they are not, and opinions are not held with equal intensity. The second problem that we have is that there is an asymmetry that favors what people feel, what people can feel and fear, versus what is abstract. And again, it's on both sides. I, for one, I understand what George Bisharat said, but I kind of doubt whether, in fact, you would be able to galvanize the Palestinian people around a concept that's rather abstract, called justice. But I also think that the same problem you have on the Israeli public, that the issue of demography and the effects of demography on Israel's character is not something that Martin's and my kids and grandkids wake up in the morning worrying about. They're worrying about something much more concrete, which has to do with, well, if Israel were to implement some of the conclusions that Asher's analysis lead to, would it bring about a repetition of what Israel experienced after the withdrawal from Lebanon and after the withdrawal from Gaza? And yes, it's become polemics, but it's not entirely polemics. In fact, I think it was in the last round of Gaza, a single projectile neutralized Ben Gurion International Airport for 24, 36 hours. Okay, and this is something that people feel. I have an uncle, he's now 88 years old. He lives in a moshav in Israel, in the south. And his moshav was rained with Qassam rockets in the last two confrontations. So his kids, who are my cousins, and his children, that's what they feel, And unfortunately, and again, regarding what should be done, I happen to be worried about some of the same issues that Asher is worried about, but I'm cognizant of this asymmetry. It's much more difficult to make the case for something that many people feel is abstract, and they don't know how to deal with abstract, and they don't know whether it will happen or not happen. And actually, because of that, the kind of arguments that Martin made about, yes, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't happen, is very powerful to to these, especially young people who don't feel this every morning. Frankly, however, I also don't believe that you can galvanize a change around the idea of simply improving conditions in the interim. It's not the kind of thing that galvanizes people's imagination. So, I mean, I think that it's between these asymmetries and the fact that I don't see, you know, the kind of political leaders, if they are real leaders and not politicians, tacticians, whose life basically is measured from how to get through the next Friday's newspapers, they have to have a big idea. And they're able to galvanize public support around a big idea. So for me, it's a little bit difficult to see how a leadership that would focus, in a way, focus its policy on simply improving day-to-day conditions, how that's going to happen. But you know, as Martin said, and I agree with him, who knows? Maybe that's possible. Again, the positive turning point happened, and we go back to this issue of the importance of leadership, happens when you had statesmen that in fact did something dramatic to change people's mindset. And I think Sadat did that with the Israeli public. In a way, Rabin did it to the Israeli public because of a conclusion that he reached at a certain point of his life. And I think it really wasn't surprising that the Israeli public basically then responded and accepted the idea of withdrawing from every square inch of the Sinai, and were willing to go with Rabin to accept the PLO that until that point a vast majority saw as basically a terror organization. This is because we had leaders that had a big idea. And short of that, I think that Martin's arguments are quite strong, that without which I don't see, without a big leader and a big idea, I don't see how we're going to move anywhere forward. So I think I've killed enough minutes for Nadim, who was supposed to come in about 2 minutes ago, to come in. I want to thank Martin and Asher, okay, for exposing all of us to this debate. I would only ask your patience for 5 more minutes. We will join you and for 5 minutes, and here, assuming that the screen is coming down, or I guess it is coming down, and here Nadim's closing comments.
Yeah, can they hear me now? No, they're going to lower the screen.
And if this works, remember my first comment about technology? Miracles happen.
Hello? This is the screen. My God, big screen.
The big idea is to build the infrastructure of a state.
Yes.
But you don't see it.
Can you hear me?
We can see you now, and we can hear you too.
You can hear us. Okay, you can hear me. Good. Thank you. It's very rare that I have the last word when there are Palestinians and Israelis speaking, so I'm going to take full advantage of it. I want to thank Shai. I personally am a beneficiary of the creation of the Crown Center, because when the Crown Center was created, Shai used to travel back and forth between Israel and the United States and pass through London, and he used to clarify the world to us on both sides during these trips. And he has truly achieved the objective of creating a center where all ideas are present and debated. And it's only when I came here that I realized how difficult a task it is in the United States, especially. I attended your 10th anniversary celebration. In Arabic, we have a saying, may all your life be anniversaries and celebrations, but some of the anniversaries we're talking about today are mourning for others, as you know. And next year, we also have anniversaries, which are similar. We have 30 years since the 88 Declaration of Palestinian Statehood by Arafat. We have 25 years since Oslo. Many of us have lost hair and turned white because of that, and 70 years since 48, the Nakba. So we have too many anniversaries. Very soon we'll be able to issue a calendar similar to the Catholic one, with every day being an anniversary. So I was thinking of summarizing the whole day in 45 minutes or so, but I think I'll summarize what I got from the whole day, from today. The single idea that I gleaned from listening to all these very rich presentations and different ideas is leading me to make an announcement. And my announcement is that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to announce So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to announce the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is over. It is no longer what it is. You know, we were saying it is what it is. It is not anymore what it is. It is a legacy of the 20th century. We are, and it's a 20th century problem which has, for the last 25 years, been looking for 20th century solutions. And since Madrid and Oslo, we have been trying to solve little problems with and saying that the devil is in the details, and saying that nothing will be resolved until everything is resolved, and nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, aiming to reach a two-state solution. I want to redefine the devil. The devil is not in the details. Details are details. The devil is in the framework. And you cannot really solve a problem with using the framework that created it. We are trying to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli issue by creating two states. I mean, the framework of Oslo and the final status is in a way a second half of the 20th century framework, where we're trying to create two homogeneous sovereign states with borders, with viable, sort of two viable entities, and basically, this state doesn't exist anymore anywhere in the world. I mean, this state is that we're trying, the sort of second half of 20th century state, or which is basically the culmination of the 20th century model, is collapsing. There's no more secure borders. The reason why we're trying to build walls is not because borders are getting stronger. It's because there are no more borders, and same in Europe, the same in the whole region. So we have different concepts of sovereignty, different concepts of identity, different concepts of belonging. We now belong more to cities than we belong to countries. Even in Israel, people are Jerusalemite or Tel Avivians. And there's probably a lot more difference between them than with some Palestinians. It is also a problem of a generation, the generation which I mean, and this is, I'm following what Abdul Munaim said, which is that he was brought up with that problem. Me too, in a way, and I spent half
my life trying to find a solution for it. But it is a problem of the last generation, and the new generation think in a completely different way, as Martin Kramer mentioned, and we have heard that what is the solution that is being proposed has not always been the same. That solution. There has been explorations of alternatives in the 1930s, as Professor Reinhardt said, and we are seeing changes on the ground that need a different type of thinking. So what I propose, in a way, is to redefine the problem. Basically, we are in Boston, and I'm in Medford, and you're in Waltham. In between us, we have settlements where you have a population that are victims of the 20th century who have come here. You have Germans, you have Greeks, you have Armenians, you have Lebanese, you have Palestinians, you have Jews from the different areas of Turkey and of Europe. So we are surrounded by the victims of the 20th century, and of the victims of the attempt to create homogeneity. All the cities in Europe are no longer homogeneous in the way we conceived them. So my suggestion, just so as not to prolong too much the conclusion, is why don't we try the reverse process, which is that instead of solving everything until we reach the perfect two-state solution with two viable sovereign states which have contiguous and permanent which are contiguous and territory and viable permanent borders and well-defined citizenry, let's try and do the reverse, which is to declare two states. It's very easy. The Palestinian state has existed since 1988. There are more people who recognize the Palestinian state as a state than more countries than there are who recognize Kosovo, for example, as a state. And all that is needed is a simple process of what the Palestinians call state actualization, which is to make it a member state of the United Nations through the Security Council resolution, which has been, of course, impossible because of the veto. But I think a lot of the reasons for that veto have now disappeared. I mean, in 2010, when this was last discussed, the proposal of Nabil Shaath at the time, in 2010, 2011, there were Israeli concerns that are no longer there. I mean, there are many other Israeli concerns, and they're understandable, but the Israeli concerns of the Palestinians using the ICC and the ICJ and UNESCO and all these institutions are no longer there because they have already used them. So we're no longer afraid of a Palestinian state belonging to the United Nations. There will be two imperfect states, two non-homogeneous, non-sovereign, without clear borders, without clear divisions. But I can't think of two states that are next to each other that don't have problems. The two states, the Palestinian state and the Israeli state, will just have more their share than others. And the advantage is that for the last 25 years, we have been resolving a lot of them through multilateral talks on refugees, on water, on borders, on Jerusalem. You can fill a whole building with temporary solutions on every issue, except the two last issues which are unresolvable, which are basically Jerusalem and right of return of refugees. And I simply think that unresolvable problems should be postponed. My wife thinks it's a bad idea, but that's what I believe. And if we declare the state now, there are lots of resolvable problems that are more urgent than whose side is to whom belongs the Esplanade or of Aqsa and others. And basically the two quasi-states are in line with what the new generation is thinking. Yair Kohenka, the student who asked about climate change, told me, forget governments. People can resolve their own problems. And people do. People can resolve their own problems on a small scale once you give them the opportunities. And so Martin Kramer's young generation, with whom he has faith and who he said are not represented, should be given that opportunity. We face far larger problems in the region than the Arab-Israeli conflict, and we've seen that for many Arab countries, rapprochement with Israel is an option, and it's no longer as hot an issue as it used to be. We face the consequences of the last century. We say in the region that a beard does not grow in one day. The beards that are growing in the region have not grown because of the Iraq invasion or because of some incident recently. They've been growing for the last 100 years, and basically the threat of fundamentalism, of extremism, is a threat to the whole world, and both sides should address it. And I think I'll end there, that we have different conceptions of what states are, and this has been discussed. I will skip a lot of this. So my way forward that I would suggest is, instead of having one more meeting on final status and on refugees and water and borders and all these things we've been discussing for 25 years, let's have one meeting preempting the consequences of a declaration of statehood. If tomorrow, next week, in the UN meetings, a Palestinian state is created, what would be the consequence? What would be the day after? And how can one preempt it? And is it a good or a bad idea? Thanks.